What's up, guys? Back with part two of our review on Unit 1. I apologize in advance if my dog barks in the background. My fiance worked last night. She's sleeping, so I'm trying to play babysitter to the puppy and make the video at the same time here. So, big idea two. Constitution emerged from debate about the weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation as a blueprint for limited government. So, you guys already know, we talked a little bit about it in the video yesterday, the Articles of Confederation fails because federal government has too little power, the states have too much power, right? So we get into the debate for the Constitution. We're at the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia, and what's happening here? So we have factions. Don't forget Federalist 10 factions. You need to know that word. Political groups that agree on objectives and policies. They are the foundation of political parties. And if you remember, we have these two factions that split up right from the get-go in that debate for the Constitution, the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. Federalists think the word federal is right in it, right? They support a strong federal government with a strong executive. Anti means against. Anti-Federalists are against a strong central government. They'd rather have a weaker federal government and stronger state governments, okay? So foundational documents that you need to know in this unit that come right from Federalists versus Anti-Federalists. You have Fed 10 and Fed 51 on the Federalist side, written by James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, and John Jay. Remember, the Federalist Papers are written to gain support for the Constitution. So think about it in the sense that if you're trying to get something done, you want to change the school dress code, right? You're going to write a whole bunch of papers that students can read, that administrators and teachers can read to try to gain support for what you're trying to do, right? They're doing the same exact thing. So Fed 10, you guys already remember, is talking about factions, okay? Federalist 51 we'll come back to in the video tomorrow, so I'm not going to get into a lot of detail right now. Brutus 1, written by Robert Yates. Again, he's an anti-federalist, so anti means against. He's trying to basically create a reluctance to ratify the Constitution. He's trying to get people to want to go against it. We think the Constitution gives away too much political and economic and military control from the states to the federal government. We kind of want to decentralize this government. Let's talk about why this is a problem. Okay, see, puppy, told you guys. Privacy, can I be in the video? She doesn't want to be in the video. Sorry, guys. So the Articles of Confederation, the weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation. So biggest two things that seem to be problematic right from the get-go for the government is that there's not a military, right? The federal government can't raise a military or have a standing army, and they don't have the power to tax. And the problem with not having a military comes to light in Shays' Rebellion. So if you remember that farmers in Massachusetts after the Revolutionary War, you probably learned about this in U.S. history last year, I would hope, they are forced to pay a very high tax pretty much right after the Revolutionary War. A lot of them are already kind of poor to begin with. They didn't have a lot of money after the revolution. They thought they fought this revolution, not have to pay high taxes, now they're paying a really high tax. So they have a rebellion, and the state of Massachusetts calls on the federal government for help. Like, oh my gosh, we don't know how to put this thing down. What should we do? And the federal government is like, we can ask other states to help you with their militias. We don't have an army. So the government can't crush this uprising because they didn't have the power to form an army at all. Long-term problem with that is it basically made leaders realize, as you can see right here, the need to revise the Articles of Confederation, because if this happened again, if this rebellion got bigger, if states didn't send their own militias to support Massachusetts, who knows what would have happened. And it kind of saw, they opened up their eyes to the fact that the government wasn't this absolute being, and that it could be something that was not long lasting if they didn't have an army. The power to tax makes a whole bunch of sense, right? We talk about all the time that the only way that the government can get anything done and do anything is through their budget, through spending money. The only way that they make money is through taxing, okay? Basically, during the Articles of Confederation, the government wants money to function, the federal government. So they go to the states and they go, hey guys, you know, we'd love $3 million, which back then, remember, $3 million is a lot of money. And they couldn't force the states to give them $3 million. They just asked. So, hey, North Carolina, hey, South Carolina, Georgia, New York, can we have some money? They received 1% of that. So you can imagine if you ask for $3 million, you only get 1% of that $3 million, you're probably not able to get a lot done. So right from the get-go there, May the Constitutional Convention, the people trying to write this Constitution, realize that the government needed to be able to collect taxes, because if they couldn't, the government couldn't operate. Okay, so getting past the articles. So the articles, we realize now at the Constitutional Convention that we're not just going to be able to, adjust or change the articles, that we needed something brand new. So we have these compromises, and this theory, or this idea of compromise, is going to be a lasting issue in American government. So multiple compromises. We're not going to get into a ton of detail about them because we talked about these in class recently. But the Great Compromise, also known as the Connecticut Compromise, remember, is the combination of the Virginia Plan and the New Jersey Plan, which creates that bicameral or two-house legislature, which has the House of Representatives and the Senate. Okay, I think at the time Virginia is a very large state. We want representation based on population. New Jersey Plan, New Jersey is a small state. We want representation just based on the fact that we're a state. So every state gets one vote. So what they do during the Great Compromise, we agree we're going to have this two-house legislature, the Senate. Every state's going to have the same number of reps. 2 House representatives will be based on population. Okay. Other compromises. In the video yesterday, if you watched it, if not, feel free to click on that link after this and go back and watch it. The Electoral College is sort of an example of that elitist democracy that we talked about, right? That with the Electoral College, we're going to have the framers of the Constitution, the founding fathers, say, I don't know if we can trust the general public to choose the president, okay? So there's electors from each state. Those electors are usually going to be people that are very wealthy or powerful, former governors, former congressmen, and the candidate with the majority of electoral votes is elected into office. Okay, if no candidate gets the majority, the House of Representatives is going to determine the outcome of that election. I'm going to force Lucy to be in the video. I had to pause and go get her. So the Electoral College is going to be put in place basically just in case the general populace can't make the right decision. We have uneducated farmers that have never gone to school a day in their life, don't even know who these people are, trying to make decisions. So now we have a backup plan. So a compromise put in place, right? We'll allow the people to vote for president, to elect this official, but we kind of have this fallback of the Electoral College just in case they mess up. All right. Here's the thing about compromise. When we talk about the Constitution, when we talk about this theory of compromise, this kind of linear progression takes place where the North and the South, from the colonial era all the way up through the Revolutionary War and now getting into the Constitutional Convention, are on completely different paths, right? The North, manufacturing, trades, people are becoming doctors, they're going to schools, right? Harvard and Yale have been open already, right? The South, plantations, agriculture, slaves. And because of that, the Constitution needs to have a compromise about what to do with the issue of slavery. Okay, we know from yesterday that in the Declaration of Independence, even though Jefferson says all men are created equal, they're not recognizing African Americans yet as people, unfortunately, right? So this last compromise here, the 3/5 compromise, basically is put in place to count 3 out of every 5 slaves in a southern state or any state for both representation and tax purposes. So if you want to think about it this way, the South's going to benefit from that representation count because their population will grow higher. The North will be okay with it because since their population is higher, they're also going to be forced to pay more in taxes. Okay, so that's where that compromise comes in place. Also, with that, some Northerners do recognize that slavery is bad, so they're going to actually ban the slave trade. So, sorry again about that. the slave trade, getting back to what I was talking about here, the South said that if slaves were banned, they wouldn't ratify the Constitution. So basically what they put in place is kind of this delayed compromise, that in 1808 they would stop the slave trade, meaning that slave ships that came from Africa or other parts of the world, like the Caribbean, would not be able to bring slaves into the United States. It didn't stop slavery in the United States, obviously, right, until the Civil War, but it's going to delay being able to import slaves. Okay. Excuse me. So, what's next with the Constitution? So, the Constitution, as you know it, currently has 27 amendments, and that word amendment means change. So, when the Constitution is ratified, it's deemed as a living document. It needs to be able to change over time to fit the needs of the country. The country is going to get bigger. The country is going to be kind of evolving over time, if you will. So we put in this amendment process, right? And we went over this in class, I want to say in the end of September. So it's probably been a while, but the amendment process. So remember that if we are formally amending it, there's steps in the Constitution. Informal amendments to the Constitution can be made by judicial interpretation. So basically, if the courts deem something as unconstitutional, right? So Article 5 describes the amendment process. There's two ways. Most common way here, 2/3 of each House votes to propose the amendments, and then 2/3 of the state legislators vote on that amendment, and it can then be added into the Constitution. So for example, we'll use the 19th Amendment, giving women the right to vote. So 2/3 of members of the House of Representatives vote on the amendment, goes to the Senate, 2/3 of the Senate approve the amendment. That amendment's then approved by the federal government. But before it can be added to the Constitution, it goes to each state. So the New York State Legislature, the Louisiana State Legislature, Maine, California, whatever, right, would then vote on the same amendment. If 2/3 of those state legislators approve the amendment, that it would then be added into the Constitution. Okay. The other less common way would be that 3/4 of each House votes to approve an amendment, and then they hold special elections in each state to choose delegates on ratification conventions, and then 3/4 of those conventions approve the amendment. So this way on the right side here, very uncommon. This is your most common way that things are going to be amended. Okay. All right, moving on. Almost done. So last step here with the Constitution, political negotiations and compromise and the development of the constitutional system. So basically, what does that mean? We're talking about debates. We're talking about balancing rights of individuals, state powers, national powers, things like that. So the government is going to add in those certain checks, including checks and balances and federalism, to create levels of government that creates a system that sort of helps the anti-federalists get over the fact that the federal government is becoming more powerful, and also allows the people to feel like they still have a direct involvement in their government. Okay, so federalism, again, think levels of government, state governments kind of in the middle, local governments like the city of Buffalo below it, the federal government above it. But each one of those levels of government is going to have its own powers and things that they can do. And then also will be shared powers. So for example, it is up to New York State to set the speed limit on the thruway, right? The federal government doesn't decide what the speed limit on the 90 is, but New York State cannot raise an army like the federal government could. Shared powers, things like tax, right? When you work your job and you get a paycheck, you're going to see that there's federal taxes taken out as well as state taxes taken out. Okay, so you can look through here. There's some examples of the government using powers here. Debate over time, the Patriot Act, which we talked about, like the government listening in on people's phone calls after September 11th. The role of the federal government in public school education is a federalism issue, right? Usually the states have the power to regulate education, right? New York State has regents exams, not the entire country. So things like that. So feel free to take a look at this. The debate over the role of the government, the powers of the government is going to be detailed in this unit as well. Okay. So tomorrow I'll come back on. We'll do big idea 3 to get you through this first unit. If you have any questions, so feel free to let me know. Sorry again about the dog barking today, but we'll get through it. So you guys have a good day.